My coffee pot, mais qu'est-ce que tu fais?
Allez, va-t'en.
I've been sad about my father because I never talked to him.
Robert Clary held on to secrets for decades, seeing Hollywood turn stories into whispers and gossip. But before his final days, he broke his silence about a mystery that had haunted TV history, the shocking death of Bob Crane. Crane, once loved as a star, met a violent end that stunned fans everywhere. Many tried to guess what truly happened, but answers remained buried. Clary, with his quiet strength, finally revealed the truth he had kept inside. His words brought light to the darkness surrounding that tragic night, and what he exposed about Bob Crane's fate left the world breathless. Let's reveal what was hidden for decades. Bob Crane's story was one of glowing fame, complex desires, and a life that spun between the gleam of Hollywood lights and the shadows of private indulgence. Known to millions as the quick-witted Conal Hogan from the mega-hit TV show Hogan's Heroes, Crane lived a life that sounded charmed on the surface. But behind the grins, the applause, and the career success, he was a man pulled by forces that became both his escape and his downfall. Crane had built the kind of life many admired. He'd married his high school sweetheart, Ann Terzian, and together they raised 3 children: Robert, Deborah, and Karen. For years, the picture looked like a classic American dream: a devoted husband, a father, and a successful actor whose career was reaching its peak. Yet, Crane's fame opened doors that fed another side of his personality. His charm, good looks, and celebrity status drew women to him, and he indulged freely. Women found him to be magnetic. Whether it was his smile, his confidence, or simply the fact that he was a star, they would meet him, spend time with him, and often end up part of his private collection of photos and videos. Unlike many others who hid such habits in secrecy, Crane leaned into it. He was fascinated by the idea of documenting everything, creating a personal library of encounters that became one of the most talked about aspects of his life. Helping him in this unusual hobby was John Henry Carpenter, a video equipment salesman from Sony. Carpenter was well-connected, even friendly with fellow actor Richard Dawson, who would later become the host of Family Feud. Carpenter had access to the newest technology, and together with Crane, he explored the world of recording long before the internet made such things commonplace. For Crane, this was more than an indulgence. It became a form of expression, a way of chronicling his life in a raw, undressed way. To those who worked with Crane, his lifestyle was simply part of who he was. His castmate, Robert Clary, once said that it was never an issue. His private life was his as long as he was professional on set. To them, Crane was a star who showed up, did his work, and carried his charm into every scene. His personal choices were his alone, and few around him saw reason to pass judgment. Still, Crane's life was far from unnoticeable. His secret romances began to cross into his professional world. During Hogan's Heroes, he became involved with Cynthia Lynn, who played Helga, the seductive secretary in the first season. When she left, Patricia Olson stepped into the role of Hilda, and she soon became part of Crane's personal life as well. Olson, who performed under the name Sigrid Valdis, later married Crane in 1970, shortly after he divorced Anne. Together, Crane and Olson had 2 children, Scott and Anna Marie. Yet, the marriage was complicated. Olson grew uncomfortable with the influence Carpenter had over her husband. She saw how much the 2 men spent together, sharing in their strange pursuit of filming and archiving women. This tension between Crane's personal desires, his gimmick, and his marriage was real, and it shaped the later years of his life. Hollywood, meanwhile, wasn't as forgiving for an industry obsessed with image. Crane's choices became a liability. He was starring in family-friendly projects, including a Disney film named Super Dad, where he played a devoted father worried about his son. But behind the scenes, Crane occasionally showed associates the private photos he'd collected. This careless openness worked against him. Directors heard whispers, and soon gossip spread into tabloids. Publications like the National Enquirer picked up on his habit, painting a very different picture of the man millions had invited into their living rooms each week. His son, Robert, later reflected on this, believing his father's biggest mistake was exhibiting life so openly. Crane had created albums, even labeling them with women's names and details. Sharing them around the set was a risk, and ultimately it damaged the wholesome image studios wanted to protect. What Crane saw as inoffensive fun, others saw as reproach. Still, Robert never viewed his father's interests as dangerous or cruel. To him, his father was simply a man who loved women, maybe overcompensating for the frustrations he felt as his career began to stall. Crane wasn't hiding cameras or forcing situations. Everything was consensual. He may have leaned too heavily on this aspect of his life to fill a growing emptiness, but to Robert, it was never a dark side. It was simply part of who his father was. Robert even remembered moments that still made him laugh. In 1972, when he was 21, his father took him to the premiere of Deep Throat, one of the most notorious adult films of its time. To Crane, it was all entertainment. Another world where he could meet people, laugh, and be himself. But while Crane was enjoying these indulgences, his career was fading. Hogan's Heroes had ended, and TV was moving on. The cultural mood was shifting, and what once made him fascinating now sounded out of step. Roles became scarce, and Crane found himself working in dinner theaters, far removed from the Hollywood limelight he formerly commanded. His fame had been bright, but it wasn't built to last. The man who once held a crowd with his charm now faced a reality where the rooms were smaller, the stage lower, and the applause less certain. For someone who thrived on attention, this was a difficult adjustment. Crane's story is a reminder of how complex fame can be. To millions, he was Hogan, an idol, a leader, a figure of wit and strength. To those close to him, he was a man chasing connection, affirmation, and excitement in ways that couldn't remain hidden forever. His passion for documenting everything from family life to private encounters created a record of who he was, unable to separate his public charm from his private desires. The tragic end of secrets, betrayals, and an unfinished goodbye. Bob Crane had once been the man everyone adored. With his charm, good looks, and easy smile, he'd won the hearts of TV audiences far and wide. But behind the humor and the limelight, his life had become complicated, full of broken promises, bitter arguments, and dangerous habits. By the late 1970s, the star who once made millions laugh was struggling to keep his life from falling apart. His second marriage was collapsing. The love and warmth that had once been there were gone, replaced by arguments and silence. At the same time, his once bright career had faded. He was no longer the leading man who carried a mega hit show. Rather, he was only landing guest appearances on programs like The Love Boat. The gleam of fame was darkening, and Bob Crane was desperate to start fresh. He thought he'd found a way. Crane bought the rights to a play called Beginner's Luck, a light romantic comedy he'd already performed in smaller theaters. He wanted to rebuild his career on stage and maybe use the play as his stepping stone back into the entertainment world. He was only weeks away from turning 50, and he felt it was time to wipe the slate clean. Just 2 days before his death, Crane called his eldest son, Robert. On that call, he spoke about big decisions. He planned to divorce his wife, Patty. He also wanted to cut ties with John Carpenter, the man who had become deeply tangled in his private life. Carpenter had once been a friend, but now he was more of a burden, a constant shadow, always around, always stirring trouble. Crane was determined to make changes, to step away from the chaos and live elsewhere. But that chance never came. Robert later believed that when his father tried to pull away, Carpenter couldn't handle the rejection. Carpenter had followed Crane to Arizona, and witnesses later said the two men had a heated argument at a Scottsdale cafe the night before Crane's death. Carpenter had been treated like a partner, but now he was being pushed away. Robert described it as though Carpenter felt abandoned, as though he'd been tossed like a nut. Only hours after that argument, Bob Crane was found dead. On June 29, 1978, Scottsdale detective Barry Vassell received a call that would change everything. He was in Phoenix with a co-worker when word came of a brutal crime at the Winfield Apartments in Unit Wirt 32A. The body of Bob Crane had been discovered. When Vassell arrived, The scene was already crowded. Several officers were present along with a young actress named Victoria Berry, who had been scheduled to meet Crane that morning. The crime scene was far from perfect. Soon after, Crane's son, Robert, arrived, along with the actor's business manager, Lloyd Vaughn, and his attorney, Bill Goldstein. Rather than being kept outside, they were allowed to walk through the apartment, touching items, examining things, and unintentionally leaving behind their fingerprints, footprints, and hair. For Robert, this mistake would forever haunt the case. Years later, he wrote that this impurity may have compromised the hunt for the killer. Vassell still remembers it. He admitted the scene wasn't handled in the most controlled way, but he believed the damage was minimal. In his eyes, there was no major impurity that could erase the certainty of what had happened. Still, in 1978, police had limited tools. DNA testing wasn't yet available. Investigators had to rely on blood types and circumstantial evidence. All the signs pointed toward John Carpenter. There had been no forced entry into Crane's apartment. That suggested the killer was someone Crane knew well. Blood was found throughout the scene. On the doors, on the curtains, even on Carpenter's rental car. The blood in the vehicle matched Crane's blood type, type B, which was uncommon. No one who had handled that car shared it. To investigators, it looked like Carpenter had carried traces of Crane's final moments with him. But it wasn't enough. Without the murder weapon, prosecutors couldn't move forward. The case grew cold, sitting in silence for years. Then, 12 years later, new light flickered. Scottsdale detective Jim Raines examined the old evidence and uncovered something shocking, a forgotten crime scene photo. The picture revealed a small speck of brain tissue inside Carpenter's car. The tissue sample itself had long since decayed, but the image was real. A judge ruled it admissible, and in 1992, John Carpenter was finally charged with Crane's murder. The trial, however, was far from simple. DNA testing had advanced, but when applied to the old blood samples, the results were inconclusive. Witnesses stepped forward to say that Crane and Carpenter had shared a friendly dinner the night before the payoff, casting doubt on the theory of anger and betrayal. Carpenter's defense counsel tore apart the prosecution's arguments. He dismissed the idea that a missing tripod had been the weapon, asserting there was no evidence such a thing even existed. The defense also used Crane's private life as a shield. They argued that anyone, an angry husband, a jealous boyfriend, could have had reason to harm him. Crane's connections had been numerous, and not all of them peaceful. Still, Detective Vassell never believed a jealous lover had been the motive. In his memory, Crane was gentle, never combative. The women he knew had liked him, not hated him. The years went by, but the questions never faded. In 2016, Phoenix journalist John Hook convinced the county attorney to reopen the case. He gained access to the old blood samples and sent them to Bode Technology Group Forensics, a reputable lab that has worked on notorious cases like JonBenet Ramsey and O.J. Simpson. It was an extraordinary move. A journalist given authorization to test evidence in a cold case. The results were dramatic but unsatisfying. The testing revealed the presence of a previously unknown contributor, but most of the results were inconclusive. The certainty remained locked in silence, the shadow of the past refusing to let go. Hook believed Carpenter was guilty. Detective Vassell agreed. Robert Crane leaned toward the same conclusion, though he also wondered about his mom, Patty. At the time of his father's death, Patty was in the middle of a divorce. If the divorce went through, she'd lose much, but if her husband was gone, she stood to inherit everything. Robert raised the doubt, but investigators never took the theory seriously. When Bob Crane was finally laid to rest, Hollywood came to say goodbye. About 150 mourners filled St. Paul the Apostle Church in Westwood, California. Among them were stars like Patty Duke, John Astin, Carol O'Connor, and Crane's former castmates from Hogan's Heroes. For a man who had searched for love in reckless places, the funeral gave him something he'd yearned for. He was surrounded by love at last. But even after death, peace did not come easily. Crane's family grew divided. His widow Patty moved his body from its original resting place without telling his first family. Later, she and her son Scott created a website that sold some of Crane's private videos. The move shocked many, and though Scott later closed the site and expressed remorse, the damage was done. He destroyed his father's massive collection of photos and videos, determined to erase that part of his father's story. Instead, he turned his focus toward recognizing Crane's achievements, hoping one day to see his father inducted into the Radio Hall of Fame. Meanwhile, Robert Crane remained estranged from his step-siblings. His mother and sisters chose silence, refusing to talk about the dark chapter that had scarred them all. To Robert, the silence was strange and painful. Families usually find ways to talk, to heal, to hold hands at the table. But for the Cranes, the subject was locked down, buried under years of distance and grief. And yet for Robert, the story never ended. Carpenter was gone. Patty was gone. Time had taken so many of the people who once surrounded the tragedy, but the riddle still lived in him. He couldn't let it go. He admitted that he didn't know what to do differently. The certainty remained just out of reach, a shadow that refused to lift. Bob Crane's life was filled with charm, humor, and the sparkle of Hollywood. But it ended in violence, wrapped in unanswered questions, leaving behind a family divided and a mystery unsolved. Decades later, people still wonder who truly took his life that night in Scottsdale. Was it the friend who turned into a foe? Was it someone else, hidden in the shadows? No one may ever know. What remains is the image of a man who once had it all, who wanted to begin again, who was ready to make changes, but who never got the chance. The hot expanse of Phoenix had its rhythm, one shaped by heat, sun, and silence. In the middle of the Sonoran Desert, Scottsdale shimmered with its luxury resorts and grand estates, a place where the rich came to escape the colder parts of the country. Arizonans proudly called it the Valley of the Sun, and on most summer days, life carried on as though the heat was just another part of its charm. June 29, 1978, began just like that. By noon, temperatures had soared past 100 degrees, and the shimmering air above the pavement gave the streets an empty, ghost-like look. Behind thick walls and humming air conditioners, wealthy residents shielded themselves from the desert blaze. It was quiet, still, almost dreamlike. Yet that illusion was about to be shattered in the most horrifying way. That afternoon, police responded to a call from one of Scottsdale's apartment complexes. It sounded at first like any other routine check. But the moment officers stepped inside, the silence of the city broke. In a dimly lit first-floor apartment, they walked into a scene so brutal it stopped them cold. There on a bed lay the body of a man. He was shirtless, his muscular frame showing that he'd once taken good care of himself. His salt and pepper hair was still neat, but nothing else was. 2 deep lacerations cut across the side of his head, and an electrical cord was tied tightly around his neck. Blood was everywhere, splashed across the wall, trickling from the ceiling, soaking the pillow beneath him. The violence of it all left no doubt. This wasn't an accident, not a natural end. It was a murder. The apartment belonged to the nearby Windmill Dinner Theater, and police soon called in the manager, Ed Beck, to help identify the victim. At first glance, it sounded impossible. The damage was too great, but when Beck turned and looked at one side of the face, he recognized the man immediately. The breathless body on the bed was Bob Crane. Bob Crane was no ordinary man. To millions of Americans, he was a familiar face from TV, the charming, wisecracking star of Hogan's Heroes, the 1960s sitcom that had made him a household name. But now, on this sweltering Arizona afternoon, his story had reached its ghastly final chapter. News of the murder spread quickly, and shock rippled across Hollywood and beyond. How could someone so well-known, so cherished in his prime, come to such a violent end in an ordinary Scottsdale apartment? As investigators dug deeper, what they found was a life far more complicated and far more troubled than the world had ever imagined. Behind Bob Crane's bright smile and easy charm was another life, one he kept hidden from the public eye. While his fans adored him for his humor and magnetism, privately he was consumed by a preoccupation that changed the course of his life. He'd been collecting photos, films, and recordings of his encounters with women, filling his dressing room with Polaroids, negatives, and rolls of adult material. To those closest to him, it was no secret. His son, Robert, would later describe his father's private world as addicting, a place where the preoccupation with sex had taken over. For Bob, the lines between fame and desire blurred. What had once been a brilliant career began to deteriorate under the weight of his personal life. The man who once stood at the top of Hollywood's golden ladder was slowly slipping, moving from starring roles to smaller performances, his once bright light darkening in the shadows of his secret world. By the time of his death, his career had formally faded, leaving behind not just an unfinished life, but haunting questions that lingered for decades. The shock of the murder wasn't just in the violence, but in the riddle it left behind. No one had seen it coming, and no one could say with certainty who was responsible. Over time, investigations were launched, restarted, and studied again. Books were written, theories spread, and even a film was made, each trying to piece together the puzzle of what happened that night. Yet the case reached no clear conclusion. For his family, especially his son, the lack of answers left a wound that never healed. For Robert Crane, the pain wasn't only about losing a father in such a brutal way. It was also about living with the endless questions. He'd later write about the struggle, the way the fog of uncertainty never lifted. Words like closure meant little when the certainty stayed locked down. The unanswered questions became part of their lives, a weight that time could not erase. Bob Crane's story was more than a murder mystery. It was also the story of a man who had lived two very different lives, one in the limelight and one in the shadows. On one hand, he was the beloved actor who had made millions laugh as Conal Hogan, the smooth-talking prisoner who always outwitted the bumbling Nazis on TV. On the other, he was a man battling demons, a man whose choices pulled him away from the success he once had. Back in 1965, when Hogan's Heroes first aired, no one could have predicted the path his life would take. The show was unlike anything else on TV at the time. Just 20 years after the end of World War II, it dared to blend comedy with a backdrop of war, something unbelievable for many. Yet, the audience embraced it. The story of clever captives outsmarting foolish German officers became an instant success, running for 6 seasons and turning Bob Crane into a star. His road to fame hadn't been straightforward. Born in Connecticut, Crane first found his voice on the radio. As a popular host in Los Angeles, he interviewed the biggest stars of the day, from Marilyn Monroe to Bob Hope. His charm and quick wit caught the attention of TV producers, and soon he was stepping in front of the camera. Guest appearances on shows like The Dick Van Dyke Show and The Donna Reed Show paved the way for his breakout role, Hogan. For a while, it seemed like he'd had everything: talent, fame, and the adoration of an audience across the country. But as the show ended and his career broke, the darker parts of his private life grew larger. The cheerful image that had won him millions of fans no longer matched the reality of his struggles. By the late 1970s, he was performing at smaller venues like the Windmill Dinner Theater in Scottsdale, far from the glamour of Hollywood. And then came that June day, the day when silence fell over Scottsdale's desert streets, and the name Bob Crane would forever be tied not only to humor and charm, but also to mystery, tragedy, and unanswered questions. More than 4 decades later, the case remains one of Hollywood's most haunting unsolved stories. No trial, no investigation, no book or film has ever been able to provide a final answer. His life, full of both brilliance and excesses, ended with a crime that remains clouded in silence. What lingers isn't only the memory of his success, but the sadness of what might have been. For his fans, Bob Crane will be remembered as the witty, kind Conal Hogan. For his family, he'll always be the man whose story ended too soon, leaving behind a trail of questions that time could not erase. And so, the Valley of the Sun, where Scottsdale's streets once lay empty in the heat of June, still carries the memory of that day, a day when humor, fame, and life itself were cut short, leaving behind a story that remains as haunting as the desert silence. In 2003, Robert Clary had made up his mind. He wasn't going to take part in gossip and he'd not lend his voice to stories that tried to tarnish the name of Bob Crane. He said, no forcefully, and he kept saying, no. Who could blame him? We were strangers to him, and the so-called biopic that had been released had already caused deep pain to those who truly cared about Crane. That film had tried to strip down the character of a man who had already left the world, and it left scars. For Clary, the answer was simple. He would not be part of that kind of talk. When Bob Crane was murdered in 1978, the cast and crew of Hogan's Heroes had made a private pact to one another. They decided they would only give interviews if they could speak of the good in him. They wanted to protect his memory, to highlight his kindness and talent instead of letting the world reduce him to headlines. Because of that pact, few people came forward. After all, the world often wanted reproach, not virtuousness. Still, there were those who hoped Clary might share his voice one day. Through persistence and patience, we reached actress Arlene Martell, who had guest-starred on Hogan's Heroes many times. She was gracious and warm, and after her interview with us, she offered to speak with Clary on our behalf. Her note subsequently made us smile, though the answer was still the same. He was polite, but it was not formal, again. Yet, hope is a gentle thing, and we didn't let it die. By 2008, we had gathered many more interviews and exchanges with people who had worked with Clary. People he knew and trusted from his Hogan's Heroes days. With a list of names he could verify, we reached out one last time. I sent him a letter, carefully written with details of all those who had already contributed, and then, finally, something changed. For the first time, there was an answer. He didn't agree to a phone call or a personal interview, but rather, he gave us something even better, a handwritten letter. 2 full pages filled with stories, memories, and reflections. In that letter, Clary discussed how much he'd enjoyed working with Bob Crane. He described Crane as a professional who rarely missed his lines, a man who brought ease and joy to the set. He even recalled their playful debates about politics. Crane, the lone Democrat among mostly Republicans, would raise his voice in excitement during arguments. Clary would tease him, saying that shifting from baritone to a high soprano would never make his point correct. They would laugh, and the mood would always lighten again. Clary also touched on Bob Crane's personal life, however, with tender-heartedness rather than judgment. He described it simply as Crane's way of living. He added words that spoke volumes. Who am I to be hypocritical? What's good for the goose may not be good for the gander. And who cares? Those last 2 words, who cares, were squeezed in almost as an afterthought, but they carried the weight of his feelings. He wanted it clear. Crane's choices were his alone, and no one had the right to reduce his entire life to them. This was the heart of Clary. His message wasn't one of gossip or criticism, but of compassion and understanding. He reminded us gently that people are more than their mistakes, more than their private struggles. What mattered was kindness. His life philosophy was simple but beautiful. When you find people who are nice, you should cherish them.